I'm delighted to welcome you all here this evening. I really am. My name is Jo Applin. I'm head of art history here at the Courtauld, and as a specialist in modern and contemporary American art, and having written specifically on many women artists, I cannot tell you what an honour and thrill it is to welcome Howardena Pindell this evening on the eve of her first solo show, which opens at Victoria Miro tomorrow. I've been teaching her work to my students for a number of years now, and it just never fails to inspire, excite and engage. I always get to read at least one essay on her work from my graduate students a year. Working across figuration, abstraction and conceptualism, Howardena has since the 70s examined a wide range of subject matter, from the personal and diaristic to the social and political. Texture, colour, structure and process are employed in her work to mine history and hidden histories, and to address intersecting issues such as racism, feminism, violence and exploitation. We'll be hearing more during the course of the evening about her practice and career to date, so I'll not say too much by way of introduction. The fact the room is so full is a clear testament to her work's reach and importance to so many of us here tonight: students, teachers, artists, art students, critics and curators. I want to first thank colleagues at Victoria Miro and those here in the Research Forum for their support and enthusiasm in making tonight possible. And I now just want to briefly introduce our two panellists who are going to be joining Howardena in conversation. Naomi Beckwith is Manilow Senior Curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago and former Senior Curator at Philadelphia's Institute of Contemporary Art and Studio Museum in Harlem. Her numerous exhibitions include The Freedom Principle, Experiments in Art and Music, 1965 to now, and 30 Seconds Off an Inch, which both considered the resonance of black culture across contemporary art internationally. She's contributed to publications including Art Forum, Frieze, and the New York Times, and served on the jury of the 56th Venice Biennale in 2015. She holds an MA with distinction from the Courtauld Institute of Art, and was also a Critical Studies Fellow at the Whitney Museum. She's a multiple grantee and now trustee of the Andy Warhol Foundation for Visual Arts, and is a recipient of the New Leadership Award for Art Table, where she's also a trustee. Amy Tobin is lecturer in the Department of History of Art at the University of Cambridge and curator at Kettle's Yard. Her research is published in journals such as British Art Studies, Mirage and Tate Papers, as well as in the edited books Collaboration and Its Discontents, Other Cinemas, Politics, Culture and Experimental Film in the 1970s, Feminism and Art History Now, and a companion to feminist art. She was also a co-editor of London Art World's Mobile Contingent and Ephemeral Networks and The Art of Feminism. Amy's currently working on a monograph on feminism, art and sisterhood, and she says that we can say this tonight, although we are filming as well, but that she's going to be curating a show that's with the fruit market of Howardena's work, and that's going to open in 2021, which is really exciting. I'm now going to hand over, and they're going to have a conversation, maybe some time for some questions at the end, after which we welcome you to join us for a glass of wine and to celebrate Howardena and her show's opening. So over to you guys. I'm going to set this up now.
Thank you so much, Jo, and good evening, everyone. I would be the Naomi Beckwith at the table, and we are going to have a conversation where really we're going to allow Howardena to dominate. We'll act more as moderators, really fielding questions to her so that you could see her voice, or you can hear her voice. But before we begin, I just want to thank you, Jo, so much for the invitation and congratulate Victoria Miro on hosting what is sure to be a fantastic exhibition. And I congratulate you, Howardena, on your first solo show here. I also just want to give a quick shout out. I think I saw Dr. Mignon Nixon somewhere here. Hi. And so just want to thank her and thank the Courtauld for really setting me up to be able to do an exhibition like Howardena Pindell, What Remains to be Seen. This was an institution that really allowed me to do what for me was my foundational work on thinking about women, especially women of color in the American context, and thinking about new histories that we can tell through this kind of work. And so It is such a pleasure and an honor to be back, and I thank you, Dr. Nixon, as well, for overseeing that thesis. Howardena, hi.
Hi.
It is good to be back in conversation with you. And we thought this evening we would really just walk through your work, almost chronologically, touching on themes, touching on topics that are really resonant in your practice. And one of the first really interesting things for me is that early on your practice was figurative. And very, very soon after graduating, you went straight into abstraction. And I'm interested in what encouraged that shift in your work. And mind you, this is about, what, 1966, 67, you're graduating from Yale and moving to New York.
Well, first I want to apologize. I caught cold 2 weeks ago being in incredibly cold air conditioning. So I'm just hoping that I don't start coughing. Anyway, how to explain it? Well, in Philadelphia, it was sort of the Aiken School of Realism. The Philadelphia Art Academy, Pennsylvania rather, Art Academy was not that friendly a place, so I didn't attend any classes there, but my parents made sure that I attended Saturday classes, and my strength was in drawing. That was the beginning coursework when I was 8 years old. My third grade teacher told my parents I was gifted and that I should be taken to museums, art galleries, and to meet artists, and they did that. You know, mercifully, they started me off with a positive attitude towards the art world. Anyway, my favorite artist in Philadelphia was Duchamp, because the Philadelphia Museum had an amazing, here an 8-year-old in Duchamp. I mean, I don't know why. I have no idea. Anyway, so I progressed through Boston University, which was a realism school. And they didn't like color. The students would call it the brown sauce school. I did very tight figurative painting. And for some odd reason, I got into Yale with that figurative painting. And the teachers at Boston were not pleased because they felt I would become abstract, which I did become. And they stopped talking to me, which was weird. And I even got a distinguished award from Boston U, and none of them showed up, okay? But anyway, I just carried on at Yale, and I was more influenced by abstract expressionism. Al Held was there with Hard Edge, but he was kind of a really difficult and kind of mean man. So I stayed away from him. I didn't invite him for a crit at all. I just thought I couldn't deal with him. Helen Frankenthaler visited the school, Red Grooms, Richard Lindner. Frankenthaler, when she came into my studio, and I was figurative, she said, this was done in the Renaissance, and walked away. Well, the other students felt in a similar way that she wanted them to mimic her, or they said, well, let's do some work that looks like Helen Frankenthaler's work. She'll really like it. Anyhow, and then my revenge came later when I was working curatorially at the Modern. I was sent as a liaison between the Modern and the Whitney for a joint show of her work. So when she knew that the curatorial assistant or associate curator, whatever I was at that point, I showed up at her front door. And she was shocked. Anyway, so with Yale, I was exposed to pop art, hard edge, and abstract expressionism. But then what happened was there was an artist there, Nancy Murata, who started working with the circle. And there was something that clicked when I saw her work. I also was influenced by the close value color of Ad Reinhardt. And all of a sudden, I found I was getting like templates from a place that was called Charette, which is an architecture store, and making like circles and ovals and drawing either drawings on white paper, or I would use like a crayon or crayons, and then I would spray on top of it. And I mean, it just happened. It was like this weird transition. Then I started taking what we call manila folders, or file folders, and I would cut them and then paste them together and spray through them onto raw canvas. And it just was something, this thing just progressed. But before I did that, I was becoming more abstract in my figurative painting. Mm-hmm. But I also was up against, as a figurative painting, I like natural light. but when you have a job, you really don't have natural light. So when I would come home and work, I found that that transition seemed to have to happen in order for me to continue working.
You mean you came home at night?
At night,
couldn't
yeah.
go during the
Came
day?
home at night after a day job. I was at the Museum of Modern Art, which meant I was in this incredible visual library. I would go downstairs when the public wasn't there, and I remember just roaming around in the galleries. And the artist said, I don't know if they influenced me. Like, I don't see Redon as an influence, but his color. And also Magritte. And I mean, I'm not a surrealist at all. Guernica was there at that point. So I was just what's the word? It was like, culture was like exploding all around me. Kandinsky, and then one of the first things I did in terms of the registrar aspect of my job was to deal with Jasper John's cast beer cans. So, I mean, I was just learning so much through touch and sight. And my work this started on this trajectory where the circle became part of my work, and Poons. I became very interested in the work of Poons at that time. And between punching holes and doing the spray paintings, all of those paintings are at Victoria Miro now. Work I did in, like, between maybe 69 and 72. And the last time they were shown together was when AIR, which was the first women's cooperative, when that opened, I believe, yes, Harmony Hammond and I had a show together, and I showed those paintings. So for me, it's like refreshing to see them again, because they've been buried for years in storage.
I think it's over to me now.
Yeah.
And so when you're beginning to make those paintings with the stencil, you soon start to kind of use the remnants of the stencil, right? The chads on these smaller works.
Yes.
Can you talk about how you started to work on that smaller scale? And with those?
Well, I found that I was comfortable, and I would call it the imperial scale, like super big. What happened was, there was an art dealer named Carl Soloway from Cincinnati, and he came to see my work at a place that was a new artist housing development called Westbeth, where I had a separate studio in an adjacent building. And I had bags of holes, of dots. And he just sort of casually said to me, "How many dots are on that painting?" And so I just said, "Well, gee, I'll count." So then I got something that actually you can't buy anymore. There are newer materials that are just as good. A rapidograph pen, which was like a pen with a needle in it, but it would always clog. And then I'd take a needle or a nail, and I'd hold a little spot down, which was about 1/4 of an inch round, and I started writing numbers. And then I found that numbers for me is like, I can't balance a checkbook, but I love the act of writing numbers. Now, my father's degree was in mathematics, and I was exposed to him writing numbers in a journal that looked like graph paper when I was a child. And that would come about whenever we traveled, because he loved to drive around. There was something called an odometer, which showed you what your mileage was, the numbers would show from X to Y how many miles you had traveled. And he would just write all those numbers in a book. So I saw that, as a child. And I just, for some reason, I started sprinkling them. What I did was because it was the modern, I would sometimes have to deal with the frame shop, and I saw in their garbage, when you cut the mat, you have the inside, and you throw it out. But it was a beautiful beveled rectangle. So I asked them if I could take their garbage home, and they said yes. So that's how I ended up with that is one of the mount is one of theirs. Anyway, and so I started off sprinkling the numbers, using thread to create a grid. The thread came about because it was a wonderful job, but it paid very little. And my starting salary was $5,000 a year. And in 2 years, I got a very nice letter that said I had a $5 raise. But I was part of the group that unionized the modern because of this. One of the other reasons why we unionized was, at one point they decided, because they wanted to keep the salary level low, that anyone who had was going to be vested, and they seemed to pick on the women who were at that point of being tenured. They got rid of them. And here they were called, I wasn't called at that point that, but they called the older women who had been there in publications and whatever, they called them brides of MoMA. And they lost their jobs. So we ended up picketing the museum. I've been in front of the museum with a picket sign twice. But yet I run into former staffers who are struggling because their pension is so low now that they must continue to work, maybe teaching, or whatever. Did that answer?
Absolutely.
Okay. Oh, yes. Oh, I forgot to say, the thread was there because I had to make my own clothes. Yeah. I couldn't afford to buy clothing, especially when I was supposed to go to formal openings with a gown. Somewhere in storage are my gowns that I made.
Wow. But speaking of this thread, what it allowed you to do, though, is something really interesting, and that is bring sewing into your work. It allows you to give depth, especially to these smaller scale works, just to give a little bit of context. And I'm somewhat obsessed with these works that are on an imperial scale. Is that what you called it? Yes, imperial scale, because they're not one big piece of canvas. There's several pieces of canvas that you've cut up and sewn together like a quilt. And so there's this really beautiful kind of labor that's going in the work. But I want to actually step aside from the art objects for a moment and go back to the politics at MoMA. Also adding a bit of context, you were the first African-American woman on the curatorial team there, which is also a great kind of predecessor.
That makes me want to cough.
Don't cough. But it wasn't all comfortable. You already started alluding to this in terms of unionization. But by the late 70s, I mean, some really interesting and maybe problematic things have been happening in the New York art world. I'm wondering if you can walk us a little bit through what's happening uptown and downtown, both in terms of gender and race.
I don't know if let me capture the 70s in my memory. I mean, because so many things were happening. There was Harlem on My Mind, which was an exhibition, I believe. There were no black artists in it at all.
None whatsoever.
There was a Whitney exhibition Robert Doty had curated. And then there was a kind of, sort of odd thing that happened. Benny Andrews and Bill Williams started a African-American artist group. But what was done and what I found annoying was they were telling all the artists who were being invited to be in the show, people from Philadelphia, people from New York, whatever, not to be in the show, to protest the show. Well, I was acting director of my department when my department head was away, and which meant I attended department head meetings. And what I found was that the two artists who founded the group were going to the museums about the lack of diversity, but as a result, they were being collected and not the people that were told to stay out of the show. So I was really pissed off at that, and I decided I would be in the Whitney show. But it was a kind of delicate thing because, I mean, now I talk about it because it's so long ago, but it was just really upsetting that the competition was told to step back, while the two most vocal people who the others felt were organizing them to do something positive were the ones that were being collected.
And can I just slip in the name Donald Newman? And ask your impressions of that person.
Okay. All right. Okay, 1979 in March, there was how can I explain it? A postcard went out that said, as the title for the show, Nigger Drawings. And on the cover, I think, of the postcard was abstract, it's drawings in black. So Janet Henry, who worked part-time for the New York State Council of the Arts, who would basically review groups that were being considered for funding, she called up the gallery, and the gallery was, again, artist space, and said, why did you call the show Nigger Drawings? And so the receptionist said to her, well, charcoal is black, black is nigger. So that started, that got me really upset. Lucy Lepard, Elka Solomon, who at that point was at the Whitney, David Hammonds came to my studio. I had a loft at that point, and we made banners, and a group of us, let's see, Camille Billups has an archive, she and her husband, and they filmed and documented it all and had a teach-in. So when we first went to Artist Space, they called the police and we were locked out. We went back, and what they did was like, I mean, really so transparent. The director of the gallery was there, and then one of her women artist supporters was also there. And the woman, we were sitting on the floor, and the woman artist said, "How dare you come down to this neighborhood and tell us what to do? This is a white neighborhood." Well, it just went from bad to worse. And then people were saying, if you've criticized Donald Newman, that is censorship. And we were thinking, now, wait a minute. Women artists of all colors, people of color in general, are censored out of the system. And this is censorship? They have an opinion? You know, so then I decided I was going to start writing about the issues. And because of my museum background and seeing it from the inside, I think I was able to take it on, where as an artist without that observation of the inner workings would not be able to do it. You know, because I knew that the use of quality was always, that word was often used against women artists and people of color. And then I would see things that for me weren't quality at all, you know, but it had a white face, a white male face, I should say. So with Donald Newman, he got a lot of support from the art world. Some people called me Jesse Helms. So I don't know if you know who Jesse Helms. He was as some of my students would say, a really bad dude. I don't know if this is a fact, but the NEA cut off funding from the visual artists at the time of Serrano's Piss Christ. And I will admit, I was on that jury. Donald Cuspit and myself, and Ned Rifkin, who was at the Hirshhorn, and then later became head of Dimonil. And so the Congress, the conservative side of Congress, decided to cut off all funding to the visual arts. A museum, for example, if I was having a show, a museum could apply for my show, but it had to be funneled through the museum.
Right, and just to give context, the NEA is America's National Endowment for the Arts, and up until Jesse Helms sort of cut off funding in the early 80s, or had it cut off, they were giving grants directly to individual artists. And then after that sort of cutoff, when funding was reinstated, it was only given to institutions and no longer to individual artists.
Well, I think what happened was that the corporate sector stepped into the vacuum. So then you saw things that the corporate sector was interested in getting funded, and I noticed at that point that a number of younger artists who did negative stereotype images were being brought into the system, whereas artists who were like abstract or figurative or whatever, if it was a negative image and if they even spoke negatively, they were embraced by the system. So I think the corporate side of it kind of acted as a spoiler in a way. They just came in and would fund things. For example, an exhibition where the negative stereotypes appeared would go to a museum that did not have anyone of color in the collection, and it had never shown anyone of color. But they were amused by, you know, certain kinds of imagery.
Right. I want to just pull back just a little bit, because we're going down a way that's really, a line that's really important. But I want to know what happened to you in your career, though, in this moment around this protest of Donald's work in 79.
I did my stuff, you know? I mean, I found that the writing was what influenced, not my painting, okay? Because that's when I really started writing. And fortunately, the museum, the Chicago Museum, the Contemporary Museum of Chicago has on their website my writing, so that you can go to the website and read that, which is probably, Museum of Modern Art Library probably has it all, but like the New Art Examiner doesn't exist anymore. They have all of that writing. You have access to it through through their website, which I must admit grateful for. Yeah.
Howardena, could we also talk about kind of your abstraction in the 1970s a bit? And I mean, I think one of the anecdotes you've narrated is the way that kind of it was an unwelcome way of working.
Yes, it was unwelcome. But that's where my work was going. And the only thing that really changed the work was a car accident. Because there's a little thing that I always say to people, you never know, you might wake up dead. Anyway, hang on.
And for context, the car accident was the same year, wasn't
79 was the same year as nigger drawings.
Yeah.
And it's the year you left MoMA as well.
Yes. Nigger drawings was March. I left in August, and then they wanted to give me a present, so they sent me to Japan to courier works of Impressionism. And, this was a little
Present.
paid present, right? Like, she's gone. Anyway. Anyhow, and then I started teaching, and it was hard in the beginning because I was in this terrible car accident. I mean, I still have a dent in my head. Actually, my skull wasn't broken. My skull was dented. And I was saved by actually a very nicely, heavily knit hat that a friend who was on a Fulbright, she was bored at times, and so she bought this really high-quality, thick yarn. And I happened to wear the hat that day, and where it had a rim, you fold it up, and that's what saved me from having a crushed skull, or I could have actually died without that hat. Anyway, so my work changed dramatically as a result of that. Like I said, you never know when you're going to wake up dead. And there are things that I wanted to express. In writing, I was expressing some of them, but there were things I wanted to express in my painting. I would say the key piece that marked that, although I had done some small pieces, Free White and 21. And that piece has legs. Like, I can't believe it. I mean, it's still going. I'm working on a new piece that will be hard to take. It's about lynching, about the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, Alabama, and also what some of the slave ship captains would do. So I'm working on those pieces. It's hard to explain. I mean, I just started looking at things differently. Like I've been to a lot of places. I've lived in India maybe about 4 months, and I remember whenever there was a funeral, I was like, oh my God, because they used to burn women alive on the funeral pyre, and apparently prior in the old days, under the earlier auspices of the religion, the woman walked around the funeral pyre. But apparently the families got greedy and wanted to get rid of the person who inherited the wealth. So then they would burn the woman. And before you were burned, you had to put your hand on the Hindu temple, and they trace it and make a kind of bas-relief. So if you are in India and you see a hand, that woman died alive on her husband's funeral pyre. And a lot of young women were terrified about marrying old men, because that meant that would happen to them at a very young age. So there was that painting. Then there was one called CS 560, because they manufactured a tear gas in the state where I was born, in Pennsylvania, that would cause fetal abortions. It was given to Israel, and it was used against the Palestinians, so the Palestinian women would lose their babies. But it was used mainly in Vietnam to make it so the Viet Cong, if they were in underground tunnels, it would cause them to choke on their own vomit. Anyway, so that picture, that painting, I started lying down on the canvas. In fact, Sati, which is about wife burning, I started lying down on the canvas, and I realized years later I was friends with Ana Mendieta and Carl. I wasn't that close to Carl, but I was friends with her. And apparently, the night that she asked for the divorce, that's when he threw her out the window. And the kind of big deal galleries, like Paula Cooper and so forth, got together and got him a lawyer who was sort of inside the art world, and they chose a judge, or a judge was put on the case, who would go to art world parties. So they acquitted him of murder. And they would have made a chalk drawing of her body on the roof. And so I see myself as lying down on the canvas and kind of emulating the crime scene. But again, it takes me a long time sometimes to figure out what I'm doing, because I'll look at it later and it's like, oh my God. Because I really didn't think about those red circles that I saw when I was traveling with my father that notified people that this glassware is for non-whites only. You know, I didn't realize that connection with my being obsessed with the circle.
You might have to explain that situation just a little bit.
Okay. My father and mother and I, my father loved to drive, and thank God he was a safe driver. We'd drive to Ohio, and I remember the segregation stuff. You know, you'd see a motel that says vacancy, and then my father would walk in, and then they'd flip it to no vacancy. Or at one point, we would take a cook stove and we'd cook in the woods because you couldn't find anywhere to eat. He was very venturesome. I don't know. But anyway, when my mother was visiting her mother and she was hanging out with her sisters, we would drive to Kentucky. She was in southern Ohio, and then Kentucky, northern Kentucky was right there near the border. And so I remember we went to a root beer stand. My father liked root beer, and they would serve in chilled mugs delicious root beer. But at the bottom of our mug, I usually carried the circle around with me. I don't know what I did with it. But anyhow, was this round circle about this big, and that meant this particular glassware, dishware, whatever, is to be used by non-whites, and that whites would use unmarked, whatever. And so that red circle, when I started punching the holes, the red circle was the size of the hole punches you can buy now, okay? But I just was so like haunted in some way, although it wasn't in my conscious memory until I realized, like, oh my God, that's why I am so obsessed with making the circle a good symbol. Granted, you look up at the moon, it's circular sometimes, and the sun and the planets and, you know, whatever. But I'm still obsessed with the circle. Yeah.
I think that's an amazing kind of an example of the ways in which something that feels utterly abstract can really be loaded with the kind of historical memory. And what's fascinating to me about your work, especially the work that comes in the wake of the accident, is that you continue with a lot of these formal and abstract experimentations, but you're really imbuing it with a kind of politic and a real memory.
Yeah.
And you're using so many kind of found objects, found images, and a lot of your handiwork is really starting to distort this very idea of memory.
Yeah, well, I must say one of my favorite pieces in terms of circles is in Victoria Miro's office. I love that piece. I was going through a really hard time personally, and like all the joy that was in me went into the work. You know, I was miserable, but I just got a great pleasure out of making that work. But anyhow, I mean, being an artist is like a high-risk profession, you know, because you just never know. I mean, I remember there was a critic who reviewed my work, I think in New Art Examiner, when I was using glitter, you know, and I was sewing the canvas and I was powdering it and everything. And he said that he wanted to lie down. my paintings were light shows, and he wanted to lie down and have sex under my paintings. This is a serious art critic. Anyway, so I ran into a lot of hostility about the work, I remember even I got a Times review at one point where my work that was about issues, as I was developing it, he said that I was shrill. And of course, that's a typical thing you use against women. Oh, she's so shrill, whatever. So, you know, like things have evolved and changed, so that I'm kind of in shock. All of a sudden, I'm getting awards for the work that I was being condemned for, you know? Is that a funny thought? I'm not going to say it. Anyway.
I mean, just aware of all these works that are flashing in front of everyone's eyes that you cannot see very well, very clearly. But we've sort of run through, I think, the whole set now, and we're on our second run. And now we're sort of looking at some of the autobiography series. So, I mean, there's much to say in the way that your painting kind of progresses, you know, in terms of from those stitched canvases to those encrusted surfaces, and then in these works, the very heavy figurative elements and the crosshatch on the surface. I mean, just stop me when you want to kind of...
Well, it's just, it was all happening, the issue-related work and also autobiography. And you'll probably be amused that this work I did in my current apartment as a horizontal, because my ceilings are 10 feet, And this one I did, I believe, in my apartment also. But the blue one, there's a lot in it, but I started using text in the work. And I think the first work that used text was CS 560, which was about the tear gas. And then I continued, like the blue one we just saw, to include text throughout the piece. And then what I would do is polymer transfer images. You can't use a photograph that has emulsion. You can only use something that's photomechanically reproduced. So what I would do is coat it with several layers of acrylic, polymer, whatever, and then you let it dry. It'll look cloudy. Then you let it dry so it's clear. Then you pop it into warm water, and you peel off the paper on the back. So that's what I would do to transfer images, like the hands on this painting, where you see they are literally photographic. They are from photomechanical reproductions. And so you just literally, you've coated it, and then you just meld it to the canvas using the polymer again, and then you just press it in to the weave.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, working on the show, leading up to the show, which opened for the first time a little over a year ago, I had a series of conversations with you and Valerie Cassell-Oliver, and I just want to say, for the audience's sake, that every time I have a conversation with Howardena, I learn something new. This is probably like our 6th or 7th conversation, and I'm just hearing the photo emulsion process. I'd love to take a little bit of a turn and talk about your experience as a feminist in the art world. You've put a lot of pressure on the languages of feminism, and especially as a founding member of this women's artist collective. And I was wondering if you could narrate for us a little bit of your histories in the art world.
Well, it's strange. When AIR first, or the founding, the kernel, the very center of the group that founded it, they found, ironically, at Artist Space, there was a registry of slides. And they came to me and said, we'd like to include you in the founding group. So I joined them. I think in the back of their heads, they were probably thinking, oh, she's at the Modern, that might be helpful. But I remember naming the gallery at one meeting, but there was always like an underpin of hostility, but it had to do, I think, with, I don't know whether class is the issue or race is the issue, I'm not sure which, and that the women in the group, most of them were married, and so they had all day, and I had a 5-day job, and so there was some feeling that I wasn't doing enough, like I wasn't coming in and sitting enough times. I helped build the gallery, or physically build it, but there was this underpinning of, I remember a group of the women came to the Modern. I was upstairs in my office, and they called me and said, come down and join us and pick it. I said, no, I can't. I can't afford to lose my job. You have someone paying your bills. I don't. I'm the only one. So there was that hostility. And then you would have people who would have a particular animosity towards you. Like there's one woman who forever, and she was in the founding group, forever keeps saying in an audience of AIR people that I don't know that I'm black. Now, where does that come from? Now, her name is Zucker, and I have found my DNA includes 2 Ashkenazi, 1 Sephardim, 1 Palestinian, and I should say, she doesn't know she's Jewish. Listen, try that approach. But anyway, so I mean, she's been saying it every time, it comes back to me that she's saying this. I mean, it's before I knew anything about my DNA and all, but anyway, it's just you would find that there would be little digs and jabs. There was one artist that would call me up and say, I'm going to do something bad to you tomorrow or whatever, and then I'd find them kind of heckling me if I was on a panel. But then I was looking at the Guerrilla Girls and what they were doing, and they were not having anything to do with race. And I remember being in a consciousness-raising group that Lucy Lepard had started, and I was the only non-white in the group. And every time I brought up anything about race, they say, we don't want to talk about it. That's just politics. We don't be bothered. And I remember going to the Guerrilla Girls, finding a way to get through to them and telling them, you must deal with issues of race, because I run into issues of race with white women. And then what came back was please be cooperative. We don't want to talk about this. And eventually they came around and started doing posters that included both race and sexism. But I think I had a lot of chutzpah because of being at the museum. I think that gave me a certain kind of attitude, because I could see things in the long run. I could see how things were planned years in advance. And so years in advance, there were only going to be white men's shows. The toughest museum to deal with is the Guggenheim. They do not answer their phones. I don't know if they answer letters, but they do not answer their phones. So I consider them like a wall. I think in their collection they have Purrier and Faith Ringgold, I think. And I think that maybe some things have changed. I mean, they would do shows about Brazil or, whatever. But in terms of their getting involved, I remember Hans Hake back in the 60s and 70s, so probably the 70s, was supposed to have a show, and it was going to be, they didn't know it at the time, but it was going to be about how the trustees were slum landlords. Yes. And so they canceled his show. And I was one of the artists that signed a petition that I would never show with them. There was a petition that went around.
And it was specifically tenements in Harlem, wasn't it?
I didn't know if it was specifically tenements in Harlem, but that may be true. Yeah, I don't know.
So you mentioned AIR, and you leave AIR in the mid-70s, right?
Yeah, AIR started around maybe 70, 71, 72. Yeah, I had two shows there. One where I first showed the number pieces, and the first one was with Harmony Hammond, where I showed the pieces that are in the gallery right now.
But then you return.
Not all of them, but
you return in 1980.
Yes, I did return because Dottie Addy was one of the members when I was a member, and her husband had died, and she wanted to sell her showing time. I had a grant to live in Japan, and I had done work after I came back, and I was supposed to have a show with Dick Lerner Gallery, and sort of a painful thing to bring up, but he owed the artist a lot of money, and I remember I told him, but 2 weeks before my show was supposed to open, that I wouldn't have the show unless he paid me, and in 2 weeks he killed himself. So that was kind of upsetting. And then Dottie Addy had the showtime, so I was able to buy her showtime for that work. Yeah, so that's how I ended up showing again. They didn't have any problem with it, just because I was an old member.
But what did you show?
The works that came out of the experience in Japan. Japan was not an easy experience because of just the general attitude towards people who aren't Japanese. That includes white folks and Koreans. They treat the Koreans terribly. It was a kind of trip where I really was just they didn't like disabled people. I wasn't disabled at the time, but they didn't like disabled people. They didn't like people who were mixed race. Apparently, if a Japanese woman had a child by an American, not Native American, probably a Native American, but an African American, that child was deported to Brazil. So that's how they got a Japanese population.
But before we stay in Japan a little bit, I think what we're getting at is that you also had another showing at the Artist in Residence Gallery, curated by Ana Mendieta.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yes, and that was a very significant piece. Can you tell us a little bit about that work?
Sure, I totally forgot. No, Anna, while she was still alive, did curate a show called The Dialectics of Isolation, and that's the first show where I showed Free White in 21. And the difference was, okay, now it's shown usually without the metronome. Originally, I had a regular TV size screen, and then I had a metronome that stood on top of the TV, and it would go like this as you watched it. And then Franklin Furness offered to show it, and they wanted to charge people to come in. It's a 12-minute tape. I said, don't give me my honorarium, just let people in for free. And people were very upset by it.
Why is that? What do you think it is?
I think it just made people uncomfortable. I mean, I played two parts. I play myself, and I play a white woman who's in kind of punky glasses and a blonde wig and white stage makeup. And I think some of the things that I cite were very upsetting to people, and yet that tape just goes on and on and on, I mean, it's often shown. In fact, I think it was in YouTube, and my distributor was trying to get it off of YouTube. I don't know. I mean, I think it speaks to a lot of issues that we have today. Issues of race. I mean, when I think of the children at the border, the southern border, I think that's all about racism. Because there are Russian women going to Miami pregnant to have children that will have a U.S. citizenship. And they are living in Trump condominiums. And it's called birther tourism. Yeah, you can find it on the web. NBC is the one that covered it. And you see all these pregnant Russian women having fun on the beach, and, no problem. This is, they can come in. Trump earned some money from their, I think it would cost you between $50,000 and $100,000 to do that per child. And I don't know who was funding that at all. So, I mean, you see the difference between the southern border. I wonder how many suicides there are now, in terms of the immigrants in the south part of this country, or coming across the border. But anyway, I mean, when I get on to Trump, I get like,
Yeah, we don't.
and he's
We don't
here
have to
now.
go there.
Well, I'll say one thing. Trump is not interested in culture. And that is a great relief.
Yes.
Because if we look, he really isn't. I mean, he already called the White House a dump. Anyway, because Hitler himself was an artist, and he went after the artist. Remember the degenerate art. If you did not do Nazi art, you were degenerate. And he would steal the collections from Jewish families, from museums, and so forth. So, I mean, Trump...
I'm just going to bleep out that last statement. Howard, there's so much that we could be talking about tonight between your work. There's 10,000 more questions about processes, 100,000 more about your activism. But I thought that maybe we could open it up to the audience and see if there may be one or two questions there before we close out the evening. And also, if there are more than two, there is a reception following this conversation, so there'll be wine and more time to engage with Howardena. I saw hands. Okay, there we go.
So I was really interested in your mentioning of the discrepancies between women and hair in terms of whether you were married or single, or you were working full-time, or you were sort of taking care of economically. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Oh, I think it kind of speaks for itself. I mean, I had a 5-day job. Sometimes it was 6 days. Sometimes I had to stay late. I had to go to formal openings, although I was kind of left out of the inside professional stuff. I mean,
So one of the things we could say is there was a huge time commitment, that if you had an exhibition at AIR, then you also had to invigilate it, you had to install it, you had to
everything.
You had to put in as much labor, physical work labor, as you did money, and that's
true.
the key thing.
Yeah.
Right? And if,
Thank you. Yeah, because that's, you would sit in the gallery a certain amount of hours. In the beginning, you would physically build the gallery, which took a certain amount of hours. There was a kind of committee work that you might work on. Whenever you had a show, you had to do your own press release. Of course, you do your resume. You would send out the information to the various publications about information concerning when the show opens, when it closes. And they were just kind of meetings.
right, they had a rule, right, where it's like, whenever we have to make a decision, we have to have a meeting. It's like crazy.
I mean, I was the only person of color. Then after I left, Anna joined, and after she died, a woman named Carolyn Martin, and I think there's another black woman, but basically I think they have an associate category for women outside of New York City. And I think there are a number of Asian women that are associates, and I don't know whether they have showing privileges, or I don't know.
Right. Yeah. Other questions? James?
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, the AIDS painting that popped up on the screen.
Oh, the AIDS painting?
Amazing.
Okay.
Maybe speak a little bit.
All
into the
right.
mic.
Let me think. I know 13 people who've died of AIDS when I was doing that painting. And what I did was I called hospitals in the New York area, and I asked them for the names of teenagers and children who died of AIDS. And they said that we'll give you the first name but not the last name. So, the hospitals, Columbia Presbyterian, Maimonides, whatever, the different hospitals, different boroughs, gave me the names. And then I included someone in my family. His name was Carmen Lewis. He was a brilliant guy, went to Juilliard, and he was so smart he built computers. Anyway, a number of my acquaintances died either through suicide or went through the horrors of dying, from AIDS. So I decided, because something Carmen said to me, he said when he was being treated, because he looked white, when he went to a hospital and they thought he was white, he would get one kind of treatment. If they thought he was Latino or black, they would give him another kind of treatment. So I really did it in his honor, or in his memory, that he made me aware this discrepancy was happening. So I included the children's names, because we didn't hear very much about the young people who were dying either through blood transfusion, or maybe the parent had AIDS, who gave birth to them, whatever. And the red edge, of course, is that it was a blood-borne illness. And there was a tape that was put out by a man named Dr. Strecker, and Gary Null, who was famous at that point for doing very kind of cutting-edge research about things, had, I found out about the tape through him, through his program. He was on a station called WBAI in New York, Pacifica. And it turns out his research showed that the AIDS virus was from a bovine Visna virus, cattle and sheep. It was not from a monkey. And he felt that it was an inside job, I'll put it that way, that it was perfected at one of the military bases, and that it was being used against the gay population as well as non-whites abroad. So that's why the red stripe, and then the text, which shows the formulas and all. And I mean, I really do it in Carmen's memory. We would always fight, I said, gay relationships are much better than straight relationships. And he said, Howardena, you're wrong. No, they're just as bad. Anyway, we would have things we'd argue about, but I'm so glad he told me about his experience, because then I could share it with other people. No.
And just to provide a bit of context for those of you who may not have seen the work or can't locate it, it's a diptych that is in the shape of two American flags, and it's called Separate but Equal Genocide, obviously in reference to the sort of policy of separate but equal education for black and white students in the States. But this, of course, is thinking about the racial dimensions of AIDS treatment. And it's a wonderful anecdote, I think, to end on, because it talks about the ways in which you can go through a certain set of life experiences and political experiences and then transform that into a kind of aesthetic object. And so we thank you for that and that gift of your work to us. Thank you, Amy, so much for being here and for these insightful questions in this probing. And thank you all for joining us.